Welcome, everyone. We will get started in just a moment. Welcome. It's great to see everyone today. Welcome, everyone. Daron, feel free to get us started when you're ready.
Wonderful. So thank you, Laura, and I will add my welcome. I'm Daron Krakow. I'm the president and CEO of JCC Association of North America, and very proudly serve as a vice chair of the board of JPro. For those who are unfamiliar, JPro is the organization that is of, by, and for all those who work in Jewish nonprofit organizations across the United States and Canada. JPro and this program are for all of us, all staff representing all religions, Jews of all ways of being Jewish, and people of every background. And we're thrilled to be offering this program today on courageous leadership and polarization. Today's program will be a conversation among three of the bright lights of the professional Jewish world. And we will relate to the topic of a remarkable article that appeared in the autumn 2022 edition of Sapir by one of our panelists, Felicia Herman, about whom I will have more to say a little bit further on. But before I say more about Felicia and introduce the other members of the panel, let me set the stage a bit. First of all, as I'm seeing the number of participants on this call continue to rise, this is going to be one of the largest program gatherings that JPro has hosted since prior to the pandemic, and we're delighted to see so many friends and colleagues from across the field. And this program is really about the power of community and the nature of our work under the banner of JPro. We are a broad and diverse professional community representing a remarkably complex web of Jewish organizations. Each of us with responsibilities, positions, and commitments that relate either to a particular part of the community geographically or ideologically, or to a particular function of the community. And while there is great variation in who we are and what we represent, what binds us together is that we are part of a larger whole, a larger community of Jewish communal professionals with a shared interest in the greater strength and vitality of the community we serve, with such remarkable dedication. We have lived through a particularly challenging time these last few years. I would describe it as a rupture that has been contributed to by a once in a, God willing, century pandemic, by political upheaval and polarization, by movements for social and racial justice, all of which have combined to, I would say, unsettle our equilibrium. For many, unsettling our equilibrium on a personal level, but for all of us, I think, unsettling our equilibrium on a professional level, as colleagues and as a community. JPro takes remarkable pride in its positioning as the convener of this broad and diverse collection of professionals. And we take pride in gathering thoughtful voices that help us to interpret, process, and reflect on the major issues of the day. And today, that major issue largely looks at how it is that we work together. Let me say a few things about our expectations for this program and what you can expect. First of all, we'll be putting into the chat the formal expectations, which I just want to read to you so that you know we're all on the same page. We know that navigating through polarization can be difficult to talk about, with deeply personal experiences and heightened emotions. As a participant in this program, we ask you to agree to refrain from name calling, speaking in generalizations, and promoting stereotypes. For those who are not prepared to comply with these guidelines, we'll reserve the right to remove you from the program. And while the program itself doesn't promote a particular perspective, our speakers have been intentionally invited to share their points of view and to do so in a manner that's respectful of our community's diversity. As with a lot of large gathering Zoom programs, you'll all be muted, but the chat function is live and will be throughout. We welcome your questions throughout the program, and we are going to devote time later in our gathering to try to respond to some of those questions, those that we'll be able to get to given time limitations. We also know that this conversation is not a one-off. The topic is important enough that we're going to continue to relate to it. And so we will look forward to thoughts and comments as we get towards the tail end of the meeting about how we and JPro can help facilitate a continuation of the discussion in the days, weeks, and months to come. How we work together is not a topic that we reach resolution about, but rather one that we continue to contend with and wrestle with and lean into together to ensure that the deliverables that we want are going to be the ones that will enable us to do the best work that we can in our jobs. I would ask as we begin this meeting that if you'd be willing to put into the prompt, put into the chat, whatever it was that prompted you to want to be with us today, a sort of a brief word so that we can compile the whys that we have all gathered. I want to mention that this session is being recorded and will be available to be shared on JPro's YouTube channel. More information on that to follow. We are providing closed captioning on this call, so if you want to enter through those three dots in the lower right corner of your screen and activate closed captioning, you will be able to see that. Throughout the program, you can turn it on or off as you see fit. Anybody requiring technical assistance along the way, use your chat feature and reach out to JPro Help. That will be a target or object of any questions or concerns you have on a technical level. And again, just a reminder that we are looking forward to trying to relate to any number of questions that you may have. You can ask questions at any time. They should be directed to Laura Herman, and she's going to do some curation for us to help us prepare to answer those questions a little bit later on. Finally, I would say that this topic and program has certainly resonated with colleagues across the field. I know that I was not alone in looking at this article when this issue of Sapir first appeared and reacting directly to Felicia to share some of my comments and feedback, an important article in an important issue, the title of which was cancellation, again, dealing with some of the contextual issues that we are all relating to. And so again, today's program on courageous leadership and polarization brings a remarkable panel before us. Let me briefly introduce them. Felicia Herman, the author of this article, is the managing director of the Maimonides Fund and the associate editor of Sapir, Ideas for a Thriving Jewish Future. She joined Maimonides after 16 years as the executive director of Natan, a giving circle and grant-making foundation focused on supporting Jewish and Israeli social innovation. She holds her PhD in Jewish history and a master's in Jewish women's studies from Brandeis University. Erica Rudin-Luria is president of the Jewish Federation of Cleveland, only the fifth person ever to have served in that role in the Federation's 120-year history, which says a little something about the strength and stability of the remarkable Cleveland Jewish community. In addition, she serves as a trustee of the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Foundation, of the David and Inez Myers Foundation, and of the Maltz Foundation. She first joined Cleveland's Federation in 2001 as a supporting foundations manager, having begun her career as a project coordinator with UJA Federation of New York. Erica holds a Master's of Science in Social Work from Columbia University's School of Social Work and a Master's of Arts in Judaic Studies from the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. Our third panelist is Cheryl Cook, the Chief Executive Officer of Avodah, which is developing a network of Jewish leaders to be social change makers in the United States. Prior to her time at Avodah, Cheryl was the Chief Operating Officer at Hazon, and has worked for close to 30 years at a myriad of remarkable organizations across the North American Jewish landscape, including Jesna, the New Israel Fund, Hillel, and the 92nd Street Y. She has her master's from the Jewish Theological Seminary and an MS in social work from Columbia University. I think you will all agree we have a remarkable group of leaders with which to engage and confer, and I'm eagerly looking forward to hearing from them. A reminder to our panelists that while an hour feels like a long time, it's never long enough. And so I'll encourage everybody to keep answers focused and brief as they reasonably need to be in order to deliver on the point. And let's get underway. Felicia, let me begin with you. A central element of your article reflects on how hard it is to be in professional Jewish leadership these days. One of my rabbis, Jimmy Dugan, from the movie A League of Their Own, famously mentioned that it's supposed to be hard. If it wasn't hard, everybody would do it. It's the hard that makes it great. So if we can agree that it's always been hard and yet feels like it's getting to be harder still, tell us a little bit about what inspired you to write this piece and whether there was a specific impetus that caused you to dive into this topic.
Great. Thanks, Daron. And thank you to JPro for having this conversation. Thanks to Alana for reaching out and wanting to do this, and to all of you for being here. It's just an incredible turnout, and I'm trying very hard not to scroll through all the pages of people because I know there are a lot of friends there, but I'm trying not to do that. So it's also just such a pleasure and an honor to be in this conversation with longtime colleagues and friends like Cheryl and Erica and Daron. And I think that at root, part of what makes difficult conversations easier to have is when you know and trust and respect the people who you're talking with. So I don't imagine that we're all going to agree on everything. And that, in fact, is part of why I wanted to write this article, because I wanted to be able to have conversations like this. So there wasn't a specific impetus. I mean, I guess the specific impetus was that we knew that we were going to do an issue of Sapir on cancellation. And it was really important to me that something in there also talk about Jewish communal life and the challenges facing Jewish communal professionals. Because I think in the last couple of years, and as you said in your lovely introduction, Daron, I've been in this field for a long time. And even before Natan was at another foundation, and I have a PhD in Jewish history. And I try to look at things, you know, the benefit of the PhD and the benefit of working in philanthropy is that you get to think and talk about the big picture all the time. So it's not just one organization or one community. I'm really talking to people all the time about different issues affecting Jewish communities, you know, all over the world, really, different sectors. How do we get here? What's going on? How do we make change in the future? And yes, in all of those conversations throughout my whole career, and even if you look historically, people have talked about how difficult this job is. Like, no question, anything worth doing, right, is hard. But in the past couple of years, the conversations have changed. And the thing that made me want to write this piece was just responding both to the anguish that I think a lot of our professionals are feeling, and also just a sense of frustration that it seemed like there wasn't anything we could do about it, that things were just getting sort of worse and worse. And leaders would say to me, like, the things that I quote in the article are all very real. Of course, I had to keep it anonymous, but, you know, people saying things like, it's impossible to lead right now, and we're all just waiting around to get fired. That was the one I was like, oh, great, now I have the title for the article. But that's heartbreaking. All the people that I'm talking to are people in whom we have invested a tremendous amount of time and money and energy and education in terms of being excellent leaders for the community. And if these are people who are feeling like, oh, I'm just going to get fired because I make mistakes, say something dumb, there's an online mob that wants to get rid of me. This, like, on a technical level, what a colossal waste of our resources and our time and our incredible assets of these leaders and the people who work for them. So that was the other piece of it. If you think about, I don't like the term cancel culture, but if you think about it, it's got two sides to it, as Brett Stevens points out in his article on this issue also, and I encourage people really to read the whole issue. Brett talks about the act of canceling, and then he talks about what it does to the culture. So whether we could think of 5 or 10 or 100 examples of things going really awry in terms of how communal professionals are treated, there's some huge order of magnitude more number of people who are looking at those things and saying, well, I don't want that to happen to me. And I think what it's caused is just this culture that I would consider to be un-Jewish and un-American and really unfair and really unjust, of not treating people with the benefit of the doubt, not treating people with grace and with kindness and with curiosity, not imagining that people who might disagree with us might actually be coming to their conclusions and their perspective from a really good place as well. I was very shaped by Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind, which is about, everybody has a different set of moral foundations like taste buds, but they're your values that you live by. And people on the other side of an issue are likely coming to their perspective based on their own vision of what the common good is and how we build a good society. So all of this sort of came back together, and I just wanted to be able to have a different kind of conversation like the one that I know we're going to have today, about treating people as if they're all created in the image of God, and leading with respect and curiosity and resilience and openness to changing our minds. Because if we want to build thriving and diverse communities, I think those are the values that we need to be living by day.
Felicia, thank you. One of the things that I think we've all been contending with is the greater difficulty in the responsibilities of leadership when it feels like the ground is literally shifting beneath your feet. And I think a lot of what was reflected in your piece was the complexities that we were dealing with, and leaders feeling increasingly the need to be tentative, to be fearful, to be uneasy. And I remember that my reaction to your article was one of gratitude for putting the topic out there so that we who are dealing with these issues would have a chance to wrestle with it with some thoughtful insight from, again, one of the bright lights in the field. Erica, talk a little bit about what your immediate reaction was to the piece when you read it the first time.
Sure. And first, just to echo Felicia's thank yous to JPro, and talking with the three of you is easy, like in terms of whether we agree or disagree. It's always a pleasure to be in community with people I have such great respect for. So I read the article and I read with pen in hand. And so I starred and underlined, and I found myself saying, yes, this is taking a toll on Jewish community life and leadership. And rather than canceling the person who has done something really, really horrific, someone says something wrong, someone says something just out of lack of education, and an angry mob can follow them online and can jump all over them online. And we're missing, when I worked as a kid at Camp Ramah, like so much was like L'Shem Chinuch, in the name of education. And we've created and set a system that's binary. You're wrong or you're right. You're demonized or you're not. You're in or you're out. So that was my reaction.
Thank you. Cheryl, how about you?
Thanks so much. It's really an honor to be here. And Felicia, you're not going to be surprised by my reaction. I thought your article was provocative. So I know that that's probably why you wrote it in the way you did, entitled it the way you did. So I really want to say there are a lot of articles out in the world today that we can all read, and this is one of them. And I love that you put this into the public sphere, along with Maurice Mitchell's article about building resilient organizations that lots of us are talking about right now who work in justice organizations. I picked up a copy of Adrienne Murray Brown's piece on We Will Not Cancel Us. There's a lot of conversation happening in the larger world around this topic. And so I want to say that when I read your article, I really thought about all of the different conversations that are happening and how important it is to have these conversations and why we're having these conversations. And so, Daron, you opened with this, but I really do want to hold up that what's happening in the Jewish community is happening in the larger culture, right? All of these conversations are happening in so many other places. The rhetoric in our public sphere has changed. And I think for the worst in terms of the way that conversations are happening. And a lot of people in power are, I'm going to say it because it's true, like legislating voices, right? Who can speak and who can't, whose humanity can be seen and whose can't in lots of different ways. And that's obviously impacting us in the Jewish community. And second, I really believe that as we happily have many new voices and experiences at our larger Jewish organizational tables, as our organizations now have more people in them who are Jews of color, queer, trans, non-binary, right? Lots and lots of other categories I'm not naming, that actually is an opportunity for us as organizations and as leaders to actually look at the assumptions we've always made and challenge them and think about, like, what are the changes that we need to make as organizations to be fully inclusive, to be safe for all of our staff. So I want to say, like, one thing that's personal here. I'm a woman. I've been coming up in the Jewish, communal field for many, many years. I've actually worked in some very toxic organizations, and there are many times where I could have opted out. I didn't, but I could have, and I wouldn't be in this leadership position. So I do think a lot about how we do need to challenge. We do need tools to challenge toxicity, to challenge abuse, to challenge harm, and that conflict is okay. So I want to, and Felicia, you touched on this a little. And some of the other writers that I talked about actually touch on this a lot, that conflict is actually okay. And I don't have to agree with my whole staff, with my whole board, with all my constituents, Felicia with you all the time, right? Or Erica with you. And that's okay. We can have these great conversations. But when it gets harmful or abusive, then we actually have to step back and try to understand that.
It's terrific insights. And I think it's noteworthy that each of us read the same piece and reacted with notably different kinds of feelings, perspectives, and insights. Maybe that's the measure of a compelling piece of writing, in that it doesn't bring about the same reaction in everybody that reads it. And Cheryl, you make an important point. So much of the work that we do in the Jewish community is fundamentally predicated about things that are happening in or about the Jewish community that are unique to us. These issues are fundamentally happening across the societies in which we're operating, and how we are contending with them within the Jewish community is where the nuance lies. I'd like to ask each of you to provide maybe a single example of how the underlying issues about which Felicia was writing presented themselves in your agency. And Cheryl, maybe I'll come back and begin with you this time. You're muted, Cheryl. Somehow I think everybody's muted but me. Bear with us, folks. We'll have this resolved in no time, I'm sure. But still not. I'll tell you what, while we're working on this, Eric, are you able to unmute maybe to take?
Sure.
Go
Does
ahead,
that work?
please. Yeah.
Okay. So just one example. So Cleveland, for those that are not from Ohio that are on, I think it's obvious today to say that we don't have easy politics in Ohio, but we don't have easy politics. And in a normal time, people come together. And COVID caused everyone to go into their echo chambers, which exacerbated differences. And I think caused a situation where people forgot that they liked each other. And so that then led to, breakdown of trust and some of exactly, I think, what we've been talking about here, which is the demonizing or canceling of other. And I agree with my friends and colleague Cheryl that when something is toxic and awful, and yes, like repair must be done. However, people can have different political opinions and not be bad people. And so where I've had to deal with it is when a community member or staff person sees something that's written and is looking for signals, either signals that were, not my words, crazy right-wingers or crazy progressives, and kind of that signaling. Does this mean you're going to teach critical race theory? Does this mean that you're not anti-racist? And I will say that there have been days where I'll get a phone call about us being, very far to the right. And then when I get that second call from the person who tells me that we're very far to the left, I generally joke with whoever's second and say, thank you so much, because you've brought me back to center. But the truth of it is, and Felicia mentioned Carol Gilligan in her article. I also was at something where I was able to learn this radical listening. And I'll tell you, looking at a different perspective and saying to someone, thank you, we didn't have that voice in the room until you expressed it, is actually a very powerful thing. And forcing yourself to put aside your personal and to instead approach the difference with curiosity, actually, I think has enabled us to get to a better place in a number of different situations, because it's allowed us to bring people closer together. Cheryl's back.
First of all, that's nice fancy footwork in the absence of one of our panelists. So thanks, Erica, for that. One of the things that I wanted to note is that the three of you, really the four of us, represent very different kinds of organizations. The Cleveland Federation is a central agency in a large metropolitan community, and Felicia sits in a prominent role at a major funding foundation, and Cheryl's organization is more in an activism space, and mine as an umbrella for Jewish community agencies across the continent. I think as a result, the kinds of dynamics and issues we might deal with will come up through different mechanisms. And as we give Cheryl a minute to catch her breath on this, Felicia, can you talk a little bit about how this manifested inside the Maimonides Fund, if it did?
I feel very lucky that this has not manifested inside Maimonides. In fact, Maimonides, I think, is trying to, did we lose her again? Oh my goodness. Well, we'll have to do it again. There she is, great. We're trying to, we've seen this pop up. It was so many of the organizations that we talked to and in the broader culture, and Cheryl's completely right. There's nothing about this that is unique to the Jews, except that perhaps, our tradition, and this is just to keep plugging Sapir, Rabbi David Wolpe has an amazing piece in this issue also about how our tradition is all about disagreement, debate, and, machloket. So it is not unique to us, although I think maybe we have a unique role to play in trying to change the culture. And at Maimonides, we're trying to do that in a couple of ways. So obviously through Sapir. And I was thinking, Daron, about your question, and one of the best examples that I have of divisiveness and polarization came up before we even published a single issue of Sapir. And there was a whole discussion online about how we were crazy right-wingers and, to quote Erica there, right? And, how could we be writing about issues without, using the people who were supposed to talk about these things, and people who just hate Bret Stephens for whatever reason, and where does the money come from? And it was like this entire conversation before a single word had even been published. And it's been, we just did a reader survey for Sapir, where the people who actually read Sapir actually feel like it's a pretty heterodox publication. A little left of center, a little right of center. And that actually was very heartening. And also our readers are pretty diverse as well. The other area that we're thinking about this in at Maimonides is we've just developed, we're in the process of developing a new portfolio on viewpoint diversity, which, to quote Jonathan Haidt again, is something that he has really brought into the public discourse of like really trying to argue that we need to have multiple perspectives if we're actually going to move civilizations forward, societies forward. And I would say now that Cheryl's back, one of the things that we probably won't have time to dig into today, but that we should absolutely talk about at some point is what does it mean? How does it shut a conversation down when somebody responds to something that they don't like, you know, with the terms that I've been harmed by that, or I'm no longer safe, or this is abuse. And so much, and we use the word toxicity, like so much of the devil is in the details here, because one person's abuse could be another person's disagreement, and, you know, vice versa. We're obviously not talking about clear, you know, criminal activity, you know, all sorts of things that I think there's a pretty obvious universe of things that are just totally out of bounds. But then what's happened in the culture is that there's this whole gray area of stuff that reasonable people might disagree on, including the definition of safety, harm, and abuse, and toxicity, maybe even. And that's an area where we're just not talking about that. And, you know, it's not sort of allowable to have a different take on that in polite conversation. That seems like a problem to me.
Thanks, Felicia. Cheryl, I'm so glad we have you back, and I'm assuming that you're in a position to unmute yourself at this stage. What you missed briefly was some initial comments on illustrations of how the underlying issues manifested in our own agencies. And so I'd be grateful if you could begin there in Avodah. How did it manifest? How did it appear? And how have you responded?
Happily. And so sorry I disappeared. My whole computer suddenly went black before. So always good timing, go technology.
Murphy's Law.
I'm going to use a specific example. I just want to say, I just want to put on the side, and I'm going to bike rack it, but there is so much that we're talking about that I think we need to dig into more. You know, language, Felicia, you were just talking about language. There's just so many pieces that I really think we need to unpack. And I know we're not going to have full time to do all of that here. So I'm going to do the best I can to talk a little bit about how this is all playing at Avodah. But I do think that there's really space for more conversation about this. And it's really exciting. I will give a particular example of what I think was a conflict that could have turned into really a polarizing moment, and in fact it didn't. And these are the kinds of things that, you know, we all navigate all the time. So a moment in 2015 when the Movement for Black Lives put out a platform, and really there was a whole conversation in the justice community and the Jewish community, and honestly that was a really polarizing moment to be in Avodah, to be in a Jewish justice organization, hearing all the conversations that were happening. It was a challenge. It was a really interesting moment because I think there was a real call and recognition in 2015 by incredible group of people who are working for a long time saying, we need to all show up for racial justice in a different way. There's a moment where there is a long time history in this country and we all need to show up. And there was a call to really, you know, sign on to and move forward this Movement for Black Lives platform. And really some really exciting things in there. And the conversation in the Jewish community, for the most part, was really around a piece in there that was about Israel and genocide. And that was a piece that was really what was called out all over the place in the press. And I felt like in many ways, there was such a disconnect and so much polarization that there wasn't an ability, there was a lot of talking across and not an ability to talk through. For Avodah, what we did in that moment is really hear the call of we all need to show up for racial justice. This was before George Floyd was killed, right? Where many of us stepped up, but for many, many years, there's lots of incredible leaders and people in our Jewish community who have been calling for us to show up for racial justice. I think Avodah was not by any means the first. There's many before us. We sit in sort of big, we walk in big, big feet, big footprints, big shoes. There we are. But we, so we really said, what is it that we need to show up to do? And what we did at that moment is we actually put together a task force to say, what does it look like for Avodah to show up for racial justice? How do we do this work well? And honestly, we're still on a journey. We implemented a lot of policies and procedures and practices at our organization, and we continue to think through them. And that's a place where there could have been a lot of polarization, but in fact, we've been able to weave through and continue to. And I worry about sort of when any of us get off track by thinking about like, what is the priority here? What is the priority? What is it that we need to be able to hear and see? And if we have purity tests around anything, I think that we sometimes lose what the priority is of a moment, of a calling, of work that we're doing. And that's when I get concerned, is when we lose that sense of priority. So that's, that's a tiny taste of a much bigger conversation.
Cheryl, I think you really beautifully anticipated what would have been my next question, which is, as an organization committed to advocacy and to justice, how has this dynamic informed the way you do your work? And I think that you've certainly helped us to see that perspective in very powerful and meaningful ways. Did the issues, these sort of underlying issues of either cancellation or call it active discontent in a way that can undermine the cohesiveness within an agency manifest at Avodah? Did you have to deal with this with your own staff, where there were these kinds of, call them either acting out or confrontations that were growing out of this dynamic within the agency?
I think active discontent is okay. So I really want to say conflict and active discontent to me are okay, as long as I come at them with curiosity and openness. So yes, of course, there's been moments in Avodah's history where not all staff agree with every decision I make. There's been moments when, right, my board has really challenging conversations. Am I losing you? But I think that I want to always see through that. I want to always see what's the priority, what's the work we're doing. Felicia, I think you used some language that I really loved around like, what's our bigger mission, right? What's our mission? To work toward the thriving of the Jewish people. What's our mission, right? To work toward creating a more just Jewish country. What's that look like? How do we do that well? And I always want to keep my eyes on the mission. So sometimes callouts are okay. I also really want to say that, like, callouts are okay if it's abusive, if something's abusive. I wish there were callouts in the day when the Triangle Shirt Factory, right? When there were unsafe work conditions and there could have been callouts in a way to change a situation like that. There should be a place for callouts, but I think when callouts are about degrading people's humanity, degrading groups and people's humanity, to me, the boundary when it starts to verge on hate speech itself. The callouts needed, and when are callouts not needed?
Certainly very helpful. And look, I think all of us on this call have sort of been in the game for a long time, serving in significant roles in Jewish communal organizations for a while. And I don't know that there's ever been a time where there haven't been confrontations or where issues haven't come to the fore that have caused us to either reflect or reconsider. I think the sort of tenor and tone of those challenges has been at greater issue in this period. And I think that leaders who are reflexively decisive have had a harder time deciding where to plant our flag on an issue, a response, to take a position in an environment in which the very ground in which we're planting it seems to be in motion. I think that has been the most unsettling thing and has had a lot of leaders taking a more cautious approach. Now, Eric, I want to ask you, running the central major agency, the big tent agency in Cleveland. How have you managed to contend with this unsettled dynamic? What adjustments have you decided to make? And what, if any, red lines were there beyond which you were not prepared to go?
Sure. So first I'll say, our purpose is not to make statements, it's to make an impact. And many, many of the people that we upset, by the way, internally and in the community, are people who would like us to make a statement about, pick a subject. It's a very, very, very regular thing. So a process was put into place actually a handful of years ago, by which we determine if we as an organization are going to make a statement. We're a consensus-driven organization. The process includes both the centrality to our mission, as well as what impact will it have if we do or don't speak, as well as is there a consensus on this. I find that the way, though, to have these, the way to deal with all of this is actually through many, many, many one-on-one and small group conversations. We've brought in Project Shema, we've brought in Resetting the Table, Robbie Greengrass and Abby Dabwer-Stern were just in. We are looking to learn from everybody so that we can have real conversations about real issues. But we're also looking at what is the impact that we want to have on that issue. Our number one priority as an organization is to make sure that the little old lady, whether she lives in our nursing home here in Cleveland, in St. Petersburg, Russia, or in Israel, the one who has no one else to care for her, that we're worried about her. So anything that we do that puts that little old lady at risk is something that we need to question, and we need to question if it's worth it. I'll also say that generally when we do make a statement, people are disappointed. The people who want us to speak louder. And the people who don't want us to speak, because there are some people who believe that we should never make a statement about anything, even if they agreed with the content of the statement. But I find that really it's the one-on-one conversations. I'll just share one other small thing, which is years ago, Federation took a position against the Iran deal. And then there was a huge parking lot discussion. And even though it seems like there was consensus within our board, clearly there were more people that were in different places than was evident at the meeting. In the years that have followed that conversation, as I've talked to people, it's become crystal clear to me that the people who were for that original Iran deal and the people who were against it were actually for and against it for the exact same reasons. I pointed that out to someone 6 months ago, and that person, you would have thought that I had just told them that they had the same opinion as Hitler. I mean, they were so horrified and offended that I would possibly say that they had similar values that actually led to their just different strategies as the folks that were on the other side, that they were, I don't know if they've forgiven me, frankly. They were so offended.
You know, it's interesting that when we're relating to here are the things that we have heard and the things that are being said. We've not really talked a lot about people's listening skills and either a readiness or a willingness to listen beyond the soundbite before making often very provocative or aggressive or incendiary responses. And being in the community building business requires, I think, people to recognize that they're not going to agree with the top line thing they've heard every time. The question is, can they respect either the underlying, the subtext, or the manner in which it was arrived at, knowing that under the broad tent, you're going to agree with many things, but not necessarily all of them. Felicia, this piece came out, and I know we're living in a sort of bizarro sense of time. Feels like you wrote this article quite a while ago, and an awful lot has happened since the early fall of 2022. Can you give us some sense of what you believe has evolved or unfolded since the article was written relative to the underlying dynamic? In other words, had you not written it then, would it be the right article to write today? Or as a result of the evolution of society, community, and our work together, are we in a different place than we were when you originally wrote the piece?
I think we are in a different place. I actually probably wrote the piece last summer, so to come out in the fall, so it does feel like 100 years ago. I think that things look, so much of this is so much worse because we weren't face to face with people. So much of this is so much worse because of social media, and I think part of what's changing is we are actually able to be together again. And that is really powerful. I remember just at the GA, which was definitely the biggest thing that I've been to since the pandemic ended, that like just seeing people like, oh, there's that person who I really don't agree with at all, on Twitter or Facebook. And I actually have to share an elevator with them. And, that's actually really important because, as I sort of said in the beginning, if you know and trust and care about people, you're able to actually have the kinds of conversations we need to have. I think also it's just become so much more clear how toxic social media can be, and that these are just not healthy places to have discussions. And I think you're seeing more and more people either opt out of that, or some people using social media, I think, to great effect to push back on it and just to say, this is not how we ought to be treating people. There's a long way to go on that front, I would say. And then I also think that just being willing to have these conversations, being willing to say there's a problem, being willing to say, you know what, I don't agree with that at all, and let me tell you why, in forums like these or in the article. Generally, I think that's what we're trying to do with Sapir, is kind of expand, this term of the Overton window, like a political kind of idea of like the universe of ideas and opinions that are sort of reasonable to have, like the things we can actually disagree with. It felt like for a period in Jewish public discourse, like that Overton window had shrunk kind of down to almost nothing. And I think it's cracking back open because I think the culture is changing, and just people like, you can go onto Substack now or listen to a podcast, people like Barry Weiss and Glenn Lowry and, John McWhorter and Coleman Hughes and Andrew Sullivan and Matt Taibbi. Is like, all I do is listen to stuff like this and read stuff like this all the time. And even that feels like was just invented in the last couple of years, and gives you a chance to just be exposed to lots of ideas that you couldn't have before.
Cheryl mentioned that some of these significant, I would call it disruptions, and I use the term constructively as much as I use it in other ways as well, began long before COVID. But certainly COVID compelled us all to move into a largely remote, interactive environment with people, and it simply changed the social dynamic. So in these last months, you mentioned the GA, there have been other gatherings, and not too long ago, JPro had an extraordinary gathering of over 1,000 of our colleagues from across the field, and we gathered in Cleveland for a remarkable conference. There's been a dividend, I believe, to our coming back together and our finding that we've missed being in one another's company. And so, notwithstanding the fact that we've been contending with these complex issues and often divisive confrontational issues, that was not the headline at the JPro conference in Cleveland. That was not the headline at the General Assembly. That was not the headline at a recent gathering of JCC CEOs. And so I think, in part at least, we are seeing evolution from the renewal of an opportunity to be together and to wrestle and tangle with issues over which we may not be in agreement, but are able to do it in an environment in which we can listen better. And so let me flip the question back, Cheryl, first to you, Erica, to you as well. Since this piece came out, or since Felicia wrote it in the summer, or since the JPro conference, what changes are you seeing relative to the dynamic around these issues that were so importantly illustrated by Felicia in this article? Cheryl?
Still think there's a lot for all of us to learn. I still think that we have to use that muscle of curiosity. Felicia, you talked about that, and I want to sort of jump on that. As leaders, I am really privileged to sit in a position of power, and I understand that. And so my question is always, how am I using that? And who is advising me? And whose voices am I hearing? I can easily get into my bubble, the bubble that I live in, and not hear other voices. And so I have to push myself to hear lots of other voices and to have lots of advice. So if I have a person in my community who tells me they're being harmed, I think I have to, of course, like trust myself, but I also have to ask a lot of curious questions. Is there something I'm not seeing that might be there that I don't see because I have a blind spot? And I actually really believe in starting to understand and look for our blind spots as we create a stronger and more thriving Jewish community. So I definitely, everything you said, Felicia, I agree with about the changes that have happened in the last, let's say, 8 months since you wrote the piece. I think that the ability to be in more relationship, I think the question that I'm always asking is, what are my blind spots? How am I strengthening the organization that's not just about like me and my 3 friends and what we know, right? Or my little bubble and what we know, but really, really listening. And that means, when I'm talking about really strengthening our racial justice chops, am I actually, right, talking to Yolanda Savage and Kwok Frazier and Gina Green and Yavila McCoy and a million other brilliant people, and Judy Williams, who works for me, right? A million other brilliant, brilliant people to say, am I missing something, right? Or am I actually seeing it? Am I doing the work, or can I just like check it off and say I'm doing it? So I think that as we are living in this polarized world, and I still really think we are, I think I'm seeing it again. I'm seeing it from power structures way bigger than any of us, that we have to constantly, our job is to kind of be curious through it, be open, and be willing to hold complexity even when it's hard. I think that's the key for me.
Thank you, Cheryl. Erica?
I think also, as Cheryl demonstrates, like great leadership also requires humility. So understanding our roles, that we are in a constant learning process, and that to be the very best leaders we can be is actually about learning from everyone around us that we can possibly learn from. And I mean, I was reminded, doing small group meetings with our entire team here, and I was in one last week, and actually the entire room were highly talented, valued people in our organization. And 2 things were shared that I never would have thought of on my own, that I never would have known, that have already fed into what it is I'm thinking about in terms of communications and needs of different parts of our professional staff, and what they need and what they want, and how to make sure that we know if we're hitting it or we're not hitting it. But I really think leadership is about learning and growing constantly, because the leader that we needed to be, pre-COVID is not the leader that we need to be in whatever this next phase in is. And I'm with Cheryl. I still see the polarization. I see relationships as an antidote, but I still see a lot of polarization.
And I think you make an important point, Erica. I think those of us who spend too much time looking back over our shoulders at the way things were and a desire to get back there only end up with a crick in our neck and no progress whatsoever. It's really much more a function of how we take the experience that we've had and that we're having and figure out how we want to get to a place that represents a better place than the one that we've been. I'm acutely aware of the time and the need to make a few announcements at the end of the meeting. So I'm going to combine my last question with a request that each of you offer whatever you'd like to offer in the way of a final word. But let me tee it up with the question of, what is the metric for healthy community? How do we measure whether or not the community on which we are working or for which we bear responsibility is a healthy one? And with that as a notion, what would you like to leave our remarkable, large and diverse audience with as a final word today? And I'm going to just circle back. Erica, I'm going to start with you, then Cheryl and Felicia will give you the last word. Erica, please.
So I would just say that healthy does not mean perfect, right? But I would look at your organization and look at if there's a culture statement, what the culture statement is. And ideally, it's aspirational. We have a culture statement here. There are some days where I'm like, yes, we got it, 98% today. And there are other days where there's a lot more work that needs to be done. But what is the role of culture, and what is both the articulated culture and what is the culture that is being driven through it? And the other thing I'd say, I love when people come into my office or call me or text me and want to talk and give feedback. Like, have a conversation. Try to have a conversation even with the person who you don't think is open to it, because far more often than not, I think you'll find that there's a lot more openness and curiosity and interest in what you're thinking than you may realize.
Thank you. Cheryl?
You asked a big question, Daron. So it's the on one foot answer. I think a healthy community, one, is really seeing all the pieces, all the people in our community, right, at the table. And at the table actually means like in seats of power, in working in our organizations. And here I really do mean like identities, viewpoints, everything, geographies, right? Like all the differences, age, right? I think we really do need to center people who have often not been at seats of power and make sure that everybody has a place to share experience. It's only because women are at the table now that I think policies and practices have changed. So I really do believe identity matters. And I really do believe that having people in power who come with lots of different identities, not everybody needs to be in power, but really will create lots of changes for good and thriving in our community. If the most marginalized people are safe, we're doing a really good job.
Terrific. Thank you. Felicia?
Well, +1 to everything that everybody just said. If we're truly talking about everybody, like, I'm all in. I think often those conversations about including everyone tend to also still demonize a lot of people who we don't think. But if we're truly talking about including everyone, terrific. I want to +1 also to what Erica said about conversations. And I'm up for conversation anytime, and you can reach out to me after this to keep talking about it. I don't know if we're allowed to say bad words on these webinars, but the expression of what happens when you assume, right? You make an ass out of you and me. It's not really a bad word. I've got lots more than that, but that's where I think we're going awry. It's like people are assuming they know who I am because I use a certain word or I look a certain way, or I'm assuming something about you. And the only way to get through that and to have a healthy community is to actually talk to each other.
Thank you. I don't think assume is a bad word, but that's all subject to taste. Before I thank you all one more time, I'd like to add a couple of thoughts. We are in the community building business. That's who we are. I think irrespective of our corner of the agenda, that's the mission. And for as long as I can remember, the pursuit of that mission felt like flowing with the current. And in these last few years, it feels a little bit like building community is countercurrent. It's just not the way that society is going. It makes the job more complicated. It makes it more difficult. It makes it more important in many respects. And being part of the next bigger thing means leaning into participation and engagement, not looking for a reason to withdraw or to remove oneself from being part of discussion and disengagement. And I think that for those of us that deal with what I would call the big tent of Jewish community and Jewish communal life, the location of the central tent pole determines how far into the corners of the community the tent is able to cover. And we have always been compelled to make trade-offs where those things were concerned. I'll give a simple illustration from the world of JCCs. The large majority of JCCs are open on Shabbat. They have modified policies around kashrut and other things that dealt with traditional Jewish communities, to the point where many in the more traditional side of the local communities don't feel entirely comfortable at the JCC. They're all invited, they're all encouraged, they're all very welcomed. But the fact of the matter is they feel a little bit like it's not for them. And I cite that as an example of the challenges that those of us who deal with central community agencies have to contend. How far can you open the tent to ensure that everybody feels equally welcomed, when you know that just in this example, you have people who are traditional and people who are anti-traditional? The more traditional you go, the more the anti-traditional people feel unwelcome. And the more anti-traditional you go or away from tradition, the less the traditional people feel welcome. And I think there are corollaries and other elements of the way we identify that simply make the job harder. Doesn't mean that we don't have to continue to lean into and wrestle with these issues. We have to. We need to constantly contend with trying to push ourselves to be better at inclusivity and engagement. But there are always trade-offs. And I think that's where the stress and the tension comes. I want to say that I think it's vitally important that JPro as an entity be a place in which we gather together to wrestle with precisely these things, and with the recognition that we're not all going to come out in the same place as the result of that engagement and encounter, but it's predicated on the ideas that the things we share, the things that bind us together, are more significant than the things over which we may disagree and may be driven apart, and that that's the critical center of gravity of the pursuit of greater community. So again, as a very proud representative of the leadership of JPro, I extend to Cheryl, to Erica, to Felicia, my heartfelt thanks for your candor, for your wisdom, for your intellect, and frankly, for leaning into the wrestling that we need to do to be a better version of ourselves. My thanks to Eliza and Elena and Laura and Katie and everybody at JPro who helped make this very large and compelling gathering possible. To those of you who took part, in addition to expressing my gratitude to you, I hope that before you hop off, you'll share in the chat any ideas about the best ways that JPro can continue to pursue and support this conversation. We welcome your feedback, and there's a link being put in the chat as well about this session and how it met your expectations. I refer you to the JPro website at jpro.org for announcements about forthcoming programs, projects, and initiatives. And I very much look forward to being together with you again soon. In the meanwhile, I wish you and all those who are close to you a Chag Sameach. It should be a wonderful and festive Purim, and we'll see you the next time.